Hello everybody. If you want to read all the stories in full, please go to www.steveuk.blog. Thank you. Short story 245, The Friendly Neighbours. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled in the countryside, there lived a group of friendly neighbours. They all lived in colourful little cottages with beautiful gardens surrounding their homes. Each neighbour took pride in their garden and often spent hours tending to their flowers and plants. One sunny morning, Mrs. Smith, who lived at the end of the lane, decided to bake some delicious scones to share with her neighbours. She mixed the flour, butter and milk together, then rolled out the dough and cut it into perfect little circles. As the scones baked in the oven, the delightful aroma wafted through the village, drawing the neighbours out of their homes. Mrs. Patel, who lived next door to Mrs. Smith, peeked over the fence and saw the mouth-watering scones cooling on the windowsill. She hurried over with a plate of her famous samosas to exchange with Mrs. Smith. The two women chatted and laughed as they shared their treats, enjoying each other's company. Meanwhile, Mr. Brown, who lived across the road, was busy working in his vegetable garden. He had grown a bountiful harvest of tomatoes, cucumbers and peppers. As he harvested his vegetables, he spotted Mrs. Johnson, who lived next to him, admiring his garden. Mr. Brown plucked a ripe tomato from the vine and handed it to Mrs. Johnson, who thanked him with a smile. The neighbours continued to connect and share with one another, forming a close-knit community in the village. They lent each other tools, shared recipes, and helped one another during times of need. Whether it was a cup of sugar or friendly chat, the neighbours were always there for one another. As the sun began to set, the neighbours gathered in Mrs. Smith's garden for a small barbecue. They grilled vegetables from Mr. Brown's garden, sampled Mrs. Patel's samosas, and devoured Mrs. Smith's freshly baked scones. They laughed and talked, enjoying each other's company under the twinkling stars. As the night grew darker, the neighbours bid each other good night and returned to their cottages. They were grateful for the sense of community they had built together, and knew that they could rely on one another in times of joy and sorrow. And so the friendly neighbours of the small village continued to live harmoniously, sharing their kindness, laughter and friendship with one another for years to come. Vocabulary notes. Nestled. Verb. Meaning: to be situated or positioned in a snug or sheltered place. Example: the small village was nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. Cottage. Noun. Meaning: a small cosy house typically found in rural or semi-rural areas. Example: the cottages in the village had thatched roofs and colourful gardens. Tending. Verb. Meaning: to look after or care for something. Example: Mrs. Smith spent hours tending to her flowers and plants in the garden. Aroma. Noun. Meaning: a pleasant, distinctive smell, especially one that emanates from cooking or food. Example: the aroma of freshly baked scones filled the air and made everyone hungry. Peeked. Verb. Meaning: to glance quickly or furtively. Example: Mrs. Patel peeked over the fence to see what Mrs. Smith was baking. Famous. Adjective. Meaning: widely known or recognized, celebrated. Example: Mrs. Patel was known for her famous samosas in the village. Bountiful. Adjective. Meaning: large in quantity, abundant. Example: Mr. Brown had a bountiful harvest of vegetables from his garden. Admire. Verb. Meaning: to regard with respect, pleasure or approval. Example: Mrs. Johnson admired Mr. Brown's beautifully grown vegetables. Exchange. Verb. Meaning: to give something and receive something of the same kind in return. Example: Mrs. Patel exchanged her samosas with Mrs. Smith's scones for a delightful snack. Close-knit. Adjective. Meaning: tightly bound together by strong relationships and common interests. Example: The neighbours formed a close-knit community in the village, always looking out for one another. Story written by OneMin AI. Image created by OneMin AI. To read all the stories in full, please go to www.steveuk.blog. Thank you. Hello, this is Steve. If you enjoyed the story, please would you take the time to leave a meaningful comment and click on the like icon. If you want to know when the next story has been uploaded, please click on the notify bell icon to be notified. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and tell your English learning friends so they can benefit too. Thank you.